Hello all, welcome to the fourth episode of Axis of Resistance Initiative. As I earlier promised you, today we are going to hold our panel on Iraq, the Axis of Resistance Operation, Influence, Past and Future in Iraq. This is an important task and kind of complicated given to the circumstances in the Middle East, the Iranian-Israeli conflict. But we are fortunate for it because we are equipped with a very unique set of panelists. We have Dr. Abbas Kadhim, who leads the Iraq Initiative within the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. He's an Iraq expert and author of Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920s Revolution, and the Funding of the Modern State. Most recently, he was a foreign policy fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He was formerly an assistant professor of national security and Middle East study at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and a visiting professor at the Stanford University. In addition to him, we have Dr. Michael Knight. He's a Jill and J. Bernstein Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, specializing in the Middle East and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf State. He's a co-founder of the Militias Spotlight platform, which he offers an in-depth analysis of development related to Iranian-backed militia in Iraq and Syria. Dr. Knight has undertaken extensive researches on lessons learned from U.S. military operation in Gulf during and since the 1990s. And lastly, we have Dr. Renad Mansour, a senior research fellow with the project director of Iraq Initiative at the Chatham House. He's also a senior fellow at the American University of Iraq, Soleimani, and a research fellow at the Cambridge Security Initiative based at the Cambridge University. Renad was previously a lecturer at the London School of Economics and Political Science, also known as LSE, where he taught the international relations of the Middle East from 2013. He also held a position as a lecturer of the international studies and supervisor at the Faculty of Politics, also at the Cambridge. Gentlemen, thank you and welcome to our program. It's a great pleasure to have you. I want to, as I promised, alphabetically going through, I want to start with Dr. Kadhim. Dr. Kadhim, it's a pleasure to have you. You are an expert of Iraq. You are an expert of Iraq's history. We are not here to necessarily to per se talk about the Iraq's history, but I want to start this panel with the history of the Axis of Resistance in Iraq. When we talk about the Axis of Resistance in Iran's system of the networks, most of the time people have a tendency to identify Hezbollah as the beginning. But if we go chronologically through the history, some might make an argument that the first connection was actually made with the Shia Iraqis, with the Dawa Party, with the Saad family, and later on with the Iraqi volunteers who formed the Badr organization and the prisoners of war. But I want to ask you that if somebody asks you, let's say me, if we want to outline the history of the Axis of Resistance in the operation in the Iraq, the connection between the Iranian Revolution and the Iraqi Shia militias, where it began and what were the key events that formed it.
Thank you very much. It's glad to be with you and with Renad and Michael. When you talk about Axis of Resistance, maybe one of the good questions to ask to set the stage is resistance to whom? Mm-hmm. And if we were to go back in history, as you mentioned in your question, to the establishment of the Dawa Party, then it was the entry of the Dawa Party into resistance acts were to the Ba'ath regime. The Dawa Party did not start in late 1950s as a resistance group. It was more of an organizing group to advance some Shia ideas. A lot of it was intellectual. Most of the activities that came out of it were anti-communist, anti-Marxist activities. But later on, and as we see from the works of the early founders and personalities in the Dawa Party, the establishment during the monarchy time, the Shia and the monarchy were not in conflict, or they were in a mode of resistance towards it. But when the Ba'ath Party came to power and began to suppress the Shia demands and to act in a sectarian way, eliminating the Shia from the public space, you started seeing resistance. So the first resistance was to the Ba'ath Party, and that's continued. From the Dawa Party, we've seen many of the offshoots that came up to the 1980s, and that's when the Islamic Republic was established. Some of the people in the Dawa Party and in other Shia Islamic parties began to flee persecution and fear of death and imprisonment, and they ended up going to Iran after the establishment of the Islamic Revolution. And there you started seeing the establishment of the Supreme Council for Revolution in Iraq under Ayatollah al-Hakim, Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim. And also there were other groups that were in Iran under other banners. And then the establishment of Badr Corps around that time, which many people mistakenly think that it was the military wing or the militant wing of the Islamic Revolution or Islamic Supreme Council for Revolution in Iraq, but they were really independent of it. They were just coordinating with Scary, and of course that continued the activities of Badr and other groups in Iraq, and a lot of the cells that were in Iraq that didn't depart for Iran or other places, Syria for that matter. You see a lot of acts of resistance to the Ba'ath Party, and I must emphasize that a lot of the groups that were operating in Iraq, actually they were not Dawa Party or even Islamic Scary or the Supreme Council for Revolution in Iraq. I think the reason why a lot of them were labeled as Dawa was by the regime of Saddam Hussein himself, because there was a law on the books that anybody who was a member of the Dawa Party would be executed retroactively. That was a law that was passed in the early 1980s. And to make it easier for trial purposes and paperwork, anybody they catch, they will label them as Dawa Party and submit them to these sort of kangaroo courts and then execute them under that charge. In my work on the Ba'ath Party archives, I've encountered many groups that were caught and executed or prosecuted and put in extensive jail time. The paperwork does not show that they were really related to the Dawa Party or to Badr or to the Supreme Council. So if we fast forward to 2003, I think after 2003, the return of Badr to Iraq. And of course, the groups that remained in Iraq throughout the 1990s, most notably the Sadrist movement, they began to organize. And after the American initial occupation of Iraq, that was the American label they used to introduce themselves in the UN Security Council resolution that governed the U.S. activities in Iraq. And then after July 2004 on, the U.S. presence in Iraq as allied forces, the end of the occupation label and transfer of power to the Iraqis, there was a competition among all Iraqi Muslim groups, Sunnis and Shia, on getting credit for quote unquote resisting the Americans. And Sunnis have established many groups that targeted both Americans and those who worked with the Americans, basically government officials, government forces, etc. And then there were groups that were established to fight the Americans from the Shia side. To put in context, I think Badr did not involve themselves in fighting against the Americans. Mostly they did. They turned themselves into a political organization, and their excess of fighters ended up being incorporated by the Ministry of Interior, and they continued to work that way. Most of the fighting started with the newly established Jaish al-Mahdi by Muqtada Sadr, and from Jaish al-Mahdi, a lot of offshoots came out. through time. And these groups and some groups were established by Iran also. And that was, you had 3, 4, 5 groups, that were the main groups that fought against the United States forces. They were responsible for about 1/3 of the U.S. casualties in Iraq. The other 2/3 were mainly by Sunni groups. And that's how the history of that newly labeled resistance now to the United States presence in Iraq started. And the Shia side of it ended completely at the end of 2011 when the U.S. withdrew its forces on December 31, 2011. They dropped their weapons and they decided to integrate themselves into the Iraqi political process. Some of them ran for parliaments, but the skeletons of those groups remained in place, inactive, but they were there, and they were reestablished in 2014 after the invasion of 1/3 of Iraqi territory by ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or in al-Sham, and then basically the reinstatement of these groups, Badr, Kataib, Hezbollah, Asaib, al-Haq, and then joined by a large number of newly established groups to resist ISIS and to fight after the collapse and the meltdown of the Iraqi military. Again, there was a fatwa by Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who asked Iraqis to join the armed forces. He did not establish militias, he didn't establish fighting groups, but he asked Iraqis to volunteer to join the armed forces. The Iraqi armed forces were in no position to take any recruits. I was on the ground in Iraq in June of 2014, and people would go to these military bases and they wouldn't find a bottle of water in the heat of June in Iraq. So they went back home cursing everybody, and then the militias were ready and they just set their desks in the street and they began recruiting people and transferring them to wherever they needed to be to fight ISIS, be it in Anbar, be it in Salah ad-Din, mainly Samarra and other areas, Beji. And then that's how the new set of militias mushroomed in the 2014, and it continued to be welcomed to volunteer and fight ISIS, both by Iraqi government and Iraqi society, until ISIS defeat in 2017. And from that point on, some of these groups are still fighting and guarding land here and there and territories, working hand in hand with Iraqi forces. Others repurposed themselves to becoming political or the armed wings of certain political parties. And of course, there are others who are through and through close to Iran and working and operating with Iran. And, they admitted themselves, nobody needs to label them that way. So it's not a monolith. You have, if you visit Michael's website, you will see a good map out of all of these groups, and each one of them had their own political agenda, their own political view, their own views on what is good for Iraq, what is good for the region. It's not a monolith. It is really a very complicated network of groups that are united by certain causes, but certainly they differ from each other in everything, including the network of loyalties they espouse. So that's kind of a rundown of the history of how that all started from the 1950s until now, with the changing concept of resistance, and resistance to whom, and resistance how, or how to resist, etc., until we are right now with what we have on the ground.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive review. I appreciate it. And I want to go to the Michael, since you mentioned his website. And ask him a question that is kind of a debatable, not a debatable, at least for the Iran's governance point of view, it's debatable. Michael, whenever there's a speak of Iran's influence in Iraq, the general assumption, at least, specifically speaking in the West, is that Iraq has been handed in a plate to the Iranians or IRGC after the US invasion in 2003. When you speak with the Iranians and when you look at the Iranians, listen to the Iranians' leadership, including Ali Shamkhani and also General Alai, former commander of the IRGC's Navy. They make a counter argument, and the argument is that Iraq belonged and was meant to belong to the Shia leadership. And they mentioned the Sadrist families, resistance against the Abbas Party that Dr. Kadhim, Abbas kindly mentioned it, and also the South Intifada under the Shia Intifada in Iraq, in the southern Iraqis. Basically, the argument is that whether the United States attack or not attack, the Iraq would have fallen into the revolution as Iran fell into the revolution. They make a case that the Iraqi army wasn't as strong as Shah's army, and Shah has still fell into the hand of the Shia clergy. What's your take on it? Do you think without the U.S. Invasion of the Iraq, Iraq would have been fine? I don't want to say I don't want to use the term sphere of influence because people use it very generously. But do you think without the invasion, Iran wouldn't have the influence that today has it in Iraq?
I'll just say this. I mean, I just recently published a piece in Hudson Institute's in-house journal on the commonality, the shared DNA, and the existing links that go between some of today's axis of resistance actors like Badr and the 1980s military organizations that were established by the Iranians to fight against Saddam's Iraq. Very clearly, I mean, at the same time as the US invaded Iraq in 2003, Badr also returned to Iraq, sending its own expeditionary columns in from Iran directly into Iraq. And I certainly don't begrudge anyone their role in fighting Saddam Hussein. I congratulate them on it. But what I would say is, since that point, we had a range of different efforts undertaken by the Revolutionary Guard and its Quds Force to penetrate the new Iraq and control the new Iraq. Mm-hmm. Many of those objectives were probably defensive initially. They were about deactivating Iraq as a possible source of threat in the future. It was hard, I think, for the oppositionists or the Iranians to imagine that they would be able to permanently remove the Sunni security establishment and replace them with trustworthy individuals from the old resistance. But it happened. And I think it went way beyond anyone's initial expectations. Eventually, with the formation of the Popular Mobilization Forces in 2014 onwards, we had the expansion of a parallel military very similar to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps inside Iran. And I think with some of the same mentality in terms of, we fought for our country, now we deserve the fruits of running this country. And other elements of the Iraqi groups that were backed by the Revolutionary Guard and its Quds Force came into Iraq and integrated with the formal security forces as early as 2003 in the amalgamation process, damage. Mm-hmm. And another set stayed outside the system and operated as anti-coalition forces involved in killing coalition forces and preventing their stabilization efforts in a number of southern provinces in particular, including killing people involved in building bridges, water purification plants, and, many other things that benefited the southern Iraqi population, but which Iran and these groups did not want to be delivered by a foreign occupier. So, a lot of these strands, they penetrated different parts of the system, and they proved extremely effective over time at penetrating the economic organs and the security and intelligence organs of the country. I think to an extent that that eventually went beyond the defensive aim of ensuring that the Ba'athist regime was gone permanently, and that America would not be able to use Iraq as an offensive base against Iran, and moved into the realm of state capture and, a kind of a corruption of what remained of the Iraqi system, in the same way, for instance, that Revolutionary Guard in Iran ended up controlling huge amounts of economic infrastructure in Iran, often not to the benefit of the Iranian people. So I'll leave it there for now, because I know Renad will have a lot to add.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now going to you, Renad. Not that I want to change the conversation, I would appreciate your take on, on Mike's point, but I also want to ask you a question. Abbas and Mike, they both kindly talk about the Shia militias, but when it comes to the Iraq's politics, there is another faction, the Kurdish faction, that plays a great deal of role in Iranian or Iraqis relation, and it goes way back. I mean, the Barzani, as you know better, the Barzani faction had been in touch with the Iranian, with the Shah, since 1960s and 70s, and then we have the Patriotic Union, the Tahrir, who also has been in touch with the Iranians. Jalal Talabani, he may rest in peace, but he also had a close ties with some. He had a friendly relationship, personal relationship with many Iranians. What I want to ask you that when it comes to Iran's projection of the influence over Iraq and Iranian-Iraqis relations, what role the Kurdish KRG and the Kurdistan's regional government plays, generally speaking, the Kurdish faction?
Yeah, I think the Kurdish, as you say, the Kurdish groups in Iraq, the two predominant parties, both have historical relations with Iran. Many of them during the Saddam Hussein years, when they were also resisting the Saddam Hussein regime, lived in Iran. Mm-hmm. Many of the sort of senior generation speak Farsi and have historic relations with Iran, the Iranian regime and the leadership there. And I would say, this was an important pillar for Iran. Many think that Iran only had a Shia crescent or whatever, they want to call it. But in fact, one of the reasons why Iran was so influential after 2003 was because it had multiple pillars, including strong relations with, the parties in Kurdistan, and particularly the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, as you mentioned, the party of Imam Jalal Talabani, for several reasons. One, the PUK, the areas where the PUK would govern the provinces or governors of Slemania and Kirkuk and those areas, are on the border with Iran. So there's historic trade networks going back and forth, which was very important for the Talabanis. And I'll give you an example to kind of show the importance of Iran, sometimes of Kurdish parties. So during Maliki's second term, there was a no confidence motion against the Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. And in parliament, they basically had the votes to remove Maliki from power. And this would have been a few years before ISIS came and sort of the collapse. And this was part of this nationalist movement that was trying to fix what they saw as a increasing sectarian and corrupt politician. In the last minute, Iran managed to convince, and this was Qassem Soleimani, very important role here, but managed to convince the PUK to withdraw their MPs from that no confidence vote in the last minutes of the vote, and therefore Maliki was allowed to stay. So I think that example shows, and there are many examples across the board where Iran was able to navigate with the parties of Kurdistan to ensure when something was going wrong in one house, they could use another house to try and navigate.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You mentioned Kirkuk, and I need to ask you a follow-up question because I know we will pass this. We will move on this topic quickly. One of the main problems with the Baghdad and the KRG for a long time was the rule over Kirkuk, which after kicking the ISIS out, the PMF and Iraqi army successfully recaptured or reclaim it, depends on the view. There was a discussion, there was some arguments and rumors that one of the reasons that Kirkuk fell so quickly and without much of a resistance, which was quite odd because the The Kurdish fighter, historically are known to be resilient, resistant fighters against any sort of ambush. They proved it against Saddam and also ISIS. But in terms of Kirkuk, there was a very successful and quite quick victory of the Baghdad. The rumor out there, as I remember, was that there was a deal between the Union and the Soleimani. But many people on Union itself, they deny it. So the question that I want to ask, and which is going to be a quick question, I would appreciate a quick response. Do you think Iran exploited the disagreement between the Democrat Party, the Barzani-led Democratic Party, and Union? And do you think they leveraged that fraction between these two groups over the issue of the Kirkuk or the question of the Kirkuk?
I think Iran's policy across Iraq has been to divide and conquer. In a way to ensure that there isn't one Shia group, there isn't one Kurdish group, and there isn't one Sunni group. So certainly, the Talabani family has had very stronger relations with Iran. And Pavel Talabani, who is now the head of the PUK, will openly advocate for better relations with the PMF. He has a very close relationship with Faisal Khazali and others. And Pavel Talabani, the story is, after 2014, when ISIS conquered a third of Iraq, the KDP moved in and declared Kirkuk Kurdistani. And after the Iraqi army, the Iraqi CTS and the different Iraqi groups, including the PMF, sort of defeated ISIS, the question of Kirkuk, they went to Kirkuk, and Pavel Talabani basically, there was this agreement made to sort of give back Kirkuk to the federal government.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned the divide and conquer issue, because it raises a question that I have for Abbas. Well, it seems rational for the Iranian Abbas that they don't want to put all of their eggs in one basket, but it also seems sometimes it gets them to the trouble, or at least that's my assumption. And one case of it is the dispute between Mr. Maliki from the Dawa Party and Muqtada Sadr, which evidently it seems the Iranian at the time decided to take the side of the central government. I want to get your take on Iran's relationship with the Sadr family, and specifically speaking with the Muqtada Sadr himself, which seems to have quite a unique character. And what drift them apart, if they are apart, in your view?
I believe there is a dispute in that sense. What happens is, Muqtada Sadr likes to be more independent than others. Let's remember that Muqtada Sadr is the most or the strongest Shia leader when it comes to having a stable, loyal constituency. So he doesn't feel that he needs to have any help to establish his legitimacy, to establish his position. He doesn't need any foreign help or foreign intercession. He also doesn't need even to be in the state. He doesn't need political positions to back his standing. Many parties and many groups, if they are not in government, they don't have relevance to our impact in the day-to-day process of Iraqi social and political life. Unlike Muqtada Sadr. Muqtada Sadr, probably I could point out two people who do not need to have a hand in government to be relevant: Muqtada Sadr and Ammar al-Hakim. Ammar al-Hakim, because of his political standing and his network of relations within the political elite in Iraq, and Muqtada Sadr is because of his strong constituency and their loyalty, and that is the reason. So his independence and being able to resist any attempt to control his decisions and his attitudes, and also a lot of it is his personality as well. He likes to be more flexible in his positions. That frustrates the Iranian taste of operation in Iraq, and certainly sometimes they seem at odds. But I don't believe that Muqtada is considered to be a foe or an enemy of the Iranians. He goes to Iran back and forth whenever things get bad in Iraq against him. He goes to Iran. Sometimes he spends some time in Iran, even for his own need. And he, in certain situations, he went to Iran to discharge some duties and some social and political obligations, and he would be received very well there. So he's not a rival of Iran. He is independent, and that sets him apart from the others who cannot afford disappointing the Iranian leadership by not marching in lockstep as asked. And I think that's one of the reasons why Muqtada Sadr stands out among the other Shia groups.
Thank you. I'm glad that you brought the influential figures, because it paves the ground for the question that I have for the mic. Speaking of strong figures, there is another figure that influenced Iraq's and Iraq's destiny for a long time, but there is no longer in the picture, and that's General Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds forces, who been killed by the Americans in 2020. After the death of the Soleimani, some rumors, and I believe I also read a report at the Washington Institute, please correct me if I'm wrong, for a short period of time, the Iraq case or Iraq folder took over by the Hezbollah, until the Iranian kind of regroup and they kind of pull their act together, basically. But the question that I have is that, to what extent the death of Soleimani himself damaged Iran's influence in Iraq? And did Iran ever recover fully from it?
Those are good questions, and I know Renad's going to have some thoughts on those, because we've had many discussions over the years about what was the impact of Soleimani's death. First thing I'll say is it certainly wasn't my analysis that Lebanese Hezbollah had a significant role after the death of Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. I don't think it's within Lebanese Hezbollah's power to come to Iraq, even back then, and tell Iraqis what to do, or for them to look towards Lebanese Hezbollah for a model. As you point out, Lebanese Hezbollah might have been at that stage the largest axis of resistance partner outside of Iran, but the Iraqi militias under people like Soleimani, under Muhandis rather, who was an early Badr organization officer and also did other paramilitary operations in combination with the Iranians in the early years of the Iran-Iraq war. They would consider themselves Hezbollah's equal, and because Iraq is a larger country, from their point of view, more historically important, they consider themselves in some ways to be at least equal with their Lebanese Hezbollah compatriots. So I think it's difficult for Hezbollah to do anything but come into Iraq to make money, largely, even today. Now, in terms of Soleimani's death and what it did, we did a lot of thinking before Soleimani died about what would happen if he was removed. What would happen to the Quds force? Who would replace him? How much was Soleimani's network personal to him, and how much of it had been systematized within the Revolutionary Guard? And what you could tell is obviously Revolutionary Guard and its Quds force are not going to collapse, and their effort in Iraq is not going to collapse when you lose Soleimani. But also, we could also see that many parts of Iranian success and Quds force success in Iraq had been linked to his personality and his personal relationships with key leaders and the longevity of those relationships. I think one of the things we noticed was that before he died, I think he was losing his edge. And that's for the same reason Brett McGurk was losing his edge too, which is that they were both doing loads on Syria at the same time. They were distracted. They were no longer necessarily Iraq specialists anymore. And they were, they've been at it a long time, and there's a lot of water under the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as a result, at the point Soleimani was killed, his influence had probably peaked. Now, would it have recovered at a later point? Would he have been able to help the Iraqi government get through some of the things it got through, and Iranian influence benefit more? Maybe. I'll say, I don't think Soleimani did a very good job of helping the Iraqi government to get through Tishreen. I think if anything, his involvement may have been counterproductive and, resulted in the first fall of an Iraqi government mid-term and of an Iraqi Muqawma, self-styled resistance prime minister. They lost their first one after 2 years, partly because I think the Iranians gave them bad advice about how you put down a revolutionary movement in Iraq. And so, what about later? Well, look, Quds Force Commander Karni, who replaced Soleimani, had a different style. I'm not going to say it was an ineffective style or even wrong for its time. After Tishreen, maybe there was reason to play a bit of a lower profile. Under academy government from 2020 through 2022, it was good in the way that the personality that the Iranians projected into Iraq wasn't too overbearing. In some ways, Karni, when you looked at Karni, you could be deceived into thinking that Iran's influence was declining because his style was different. But I will say this personally, not only was I glad that Soleimani died purely from a justice and revenge perspective, but I also think that it was a bit of a momentum breaker alongside Tishreen when it came to the growth of Iranian influence in Iraq and possibly even in Syria as well. Sometimes symbols are really important. And when you place so much emphasis and we put so much cachet on a leader like Soleimani, killing him can produce some effect. It can encourage those who think that they have a chance to throw off the militia state because you are taking down one of their largest icons and you're demonstrating to all the other mid-level icons that they can die too. And what we've seen, particularly since autumn of 2024, is that there's nobody within the axis of resistance who can't be killed. And Soleimani, in many ways, was the first. You sort of broke the precedent with that. So maybe some of the stuff that's come since has built off of that. Over.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. And I think it takes us to the Renad. After the death of the Soleimani, the Iranian government's first reaction to those who said that now you're going to lose your influence or Soleimani is irreplaceable was that Iran's IRGC activity and Quds activity has been institutionalized and figures can be replaced. Mr. Ghani came, who has a different style, as Mike mentioned. But from his record, we know that he was an Afghanistan guy. He was an expert of Afghanistan. And also, there is another, understanding of him as an individual, as a character. Our executive director, General Mackenzie, who also was the person who commanded the killing of the General Soleimani. Once I was at an interview with him, and he told me that Ghani was more of a bureaucrat. He liked to have his note with himself, rights. He liked to take care of the budget. Whoever he was, or he had a different style, and I think that's the best way of putting it, as Mike put it. But my question to you is, what was the influence of not removing Soleimani from the equation? What impact it made it?
Yeah, and Mike and I and others have been discussing this, and I think we're still sort of trying to understand the impact. I'd say one thing where Iraq is right now. Right now, the Iraqi government in Baghdad has centralized power around a Shia coordination framework, which is effectively consolidating Shia power in Iraq and stabilizing it. It has completely demobilized protests and any civil society, and has also taken power away and autonomy away from the Kurdistan region and Sunni leaders. So, I don't think necessarily that these groups that we're talking about are weaker today than they were under Soleimani. In fact, many of them are potentially stronger today because they are part of the state. And I think there's a few points here also to note. One, when we talk about the histories of these groups, it's really important to understand kind of where they come from. Whether they come from, the way that I look at these historical networks is either they come from the Jaysh al-Mahdi network. So this would be people like Qais al-Khazali, Shibr al-Zaidi, obviously Muqtada and his, Kadhim Isawi and others who are still there, who were in Iraq the whole time, and kind of have that sort of social base in a way. Then you have sort of the other network, which Abbas was talking about, that developed in Iran initially, the Hakim, the kind of Badr core, which included, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, Hadi al-Amri, and others. After 2003, some of them went into the government and some of them kind of stayed outside as vanguards. The point here is, each group, first of all, Iran's problem in Iraq, unlike in other parts where you have an active resistance, is there isn't a single PMF leader. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, we argued at the time, was trying to create a coherent chain of command, but there isn't. There's no one PMF. There are many different groups, each looking out for their own interests and competing with each other. So it's a fragmented space. And in that, yes, they will sometimes have to listen to Iran, but at other times they don't listen to Iran when it goes against their interests. And the case in point has often been, and we've seen this, sometimes even Ashab al-Haq will say, actually, we don't really like this decision. We want to do something differently. Or Qatar Hezbollah, especially when they're being told to cease fire. So the point here is it's a very fragmented space where Qassem Soleimani was, and I think, Mike is right, was beginning to lose it. And I think Abu Mahdi was trying to recontrol, because at the end of I think it has to do with at the end of the war against ISIS, before 2014, you had 6 or 7 of these groups. By the end of the war of ISIS, you have dozens of these groups, each with their own local autonomy. You have you have minority groups, each with their own territory. And so the big question is, how do we control all of this? And that's the moment when I think that made, the job more difficult for Qassem Soleimani, for Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and others. The second point, which is important, is Tishreen. The October 2019 protest was a Shia protest against the Shia leadership in Iraq. And for years and years before that, Iraq's Shia population had been chanting Iran out, out. So not only did you have fragmentation in the security space for Iran, but you also had fragmentation in the ideological space. In fact, most Shia Iraqis were saying, we don't want Iran. So this is a huge problem that Soleimani was facing, which is why he was weak. When Qaani came in, and this goes back to your question, I think that's right. First of all, he didn't speak Arabic. Second of all, he didn't have the same history. We talked about Soleimani during with many of these Iraqi groups, Kurdish, Shia, others. Qaani did not have that history with him. He didn't have the same charisma or authority. When Soleimani was in the Iraqi parliament, it was a thing. Soleimani is here. It was not the same with Qaani. And Qaani was looking to institutionalize, trying to address the similar problem set that Soleimani was struggling with, but from a different perspective. And I think Qaani had a longer term vision that was interrupted by October 7th. And because of that, it was incoherent. And I think this is where Iran is right now.
Thank you, Renad. And thank you for mentioning, the October 7th, because it brings me to the question that the next stage, which is a question for Abbas. Abbas, I have a twofold question for you. The first I want to ask you, the first part of it is the question that I asked Michael and also Renad, the impact of the Soleimani's death, because I still remember the piece that I wrote approximately around the time, I think less than a month after, for the Atlantic Council on the impact of the Soleimani's killing on the U.S. influence. So is that the first question is that did removing Soleimani make things easier for United States in Iraq? And the second question, which is the main questions, is October 7. After the October 7, we have witnessed a rise an increase of hostile language or hostile verbiage or threatful language from the Iraqi Shias against the Israelis, against the Americans to a lesser extent. But there wasn't much of an action, to be frank, specifically if you want to compare it with other sectors. Why there wasn't much of action? Not that I'm complaining, I'm just asking you a question. It wasn't because of they didn't have the tools that the Houthis or Hezbollah had, because they were afraid of the American reaction. They didn't feel the hostility toward Israel that Hezbollah felt. What's your take on it?
The lack of reaction, you mean in the last week, or is it during the?
No, during the stage of the first and the first and the second year after the October 7th. Basically from October 7th of 2023 till the December of 2024.
I see. Well, let's go to the first part of your question. I mean, it's really hard to assess if an action like the killing of General Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis made it easier or harder for either Iran or for the United States. It goes to where, what kind of beliefs you espouse when you look at those kinds of parts or aspects of the conflict. I happen to think that killing leaders is not necessarily a solution for resolving a conflict, because sometimes you could get leaders that are harder to deal with than the ones in a way that you kind of have a buyer's remorse of the plan you adopted. And that happened historically. It happened with Israel and multiple killings of leaders of the Palestinian groups, or even with the killing of the first Secretary General of Hezbollah, and then they got Hassan Nasrallah, and now who knows what will they get when the dust settles. Same thing with Soleimani. There is one measurable thing. We know that Iran's influence and impact in Iran and in Iraq is not the same, and probably will not be the same for some time to come, compared to what if Soleimani was still alive. But also, from another perspective, I think the killing of General Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, I think probably even the killing of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, which happened because he was there to receive General Soleimani. I don't think that he was the intention was to kill Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, but these two people, one Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis from the Iraqi side and General Soleimani from the Iranian side, kept the popular mobilization and the other armed groups all in some form of a formation, if you will, that gave a unity in the decision, that kept everyone in lockstep, that provided organization and coherence to what was going on the ground in Iraq, because all of the leaders of these groups, the dozens of groups, as Renad just mentioned, each one of them realized that they are not in a position to compete with a towering figure like Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis to represent this body of fighters across Iraq. But when Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was out of the picture, each one of them believed that they can claim to be the successor of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, or at least no one else on the scene that can be their boss as Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was. So it created chaos. Instead of, for the rules of engagement, if you will, for a long time, from the early days, actually, if you look at what Ambassador Khalilzad was saying in his relations with Soleimani when he was ambassador, and even before that, from those days all the way until his death, there was an understanding if they needed to deal with all of this phenomenon in Iraq, they needed to send direct or indirect messages to people like General Soleimani and to Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Now they have to work with everyone independently and separately. And that's not just for the U.S. or the Iranians or everyone else, but even for the Iraqi government. In the past, if you got Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis on board, you got your plan and you know what to do. Now you have to really make dozens of separate negotiations. Also, when and that's what, when you speak with Iraqi officials, they tell you, look, it's very hard to create, for example, a consensus. If we want to make truce, if we really want to have some time to get a break from the conflict and work out some deal, you can get 10, 15 groups to say yes, and there is one group that will act as a spoiler, and then the entire arrangement is blown up. That wasn't the case before the killing of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and General Soleimani. So now you look at it, really, there are so many ways to assess and evaluate that action, and whether it was helpful or it hindered the what used to be a smooth process in Iraq. It's hard to really give it one label or one mark or one grade. When in one way, sometimes some people might evaluate it as the thing to do, but certainly in other cases, and especially from an Iraqi perspective, from an Iraqi government, more than one prime minister, if you speak with them, they say, God, it's a nightmare now to deal with everybody and this assortment of groups that have mixed loyalties, mixed agendas, mixed philosophies, mixed modus operandi, if you will, in the way they are operating on day-to-day basis. It's really, there is no one sort of judgment you can make and you say it's valid.
And on the October 7th?
Oh, on October 7th, remind me, what was that? The groups that didn't really act in a way that were expected.
Yeah.
Again, let's remember, if we backtrack before October 7th, I had many conversations even with American and Iraqi officials, both in Iraq and here in DC. They were really praising the fact that there was an entire year of no action, negative action from all of the groups in Iraq. There was a truce from the beginning of Sudanese government up to October 7. And everybody was praising that as a good time, and that's something you could build on. The American embassy said that to me. The Iraqi government here in Washington as well. They were really comfortable with that truce that held for over a year. But when October 7 took place, then you started seeing, again, I mentioned in my first segment, this competition sometimes to get credit for something. So you see the Yemenis are doing something, the Lebanese are doing something, and here are the Iraqi groups that see their resistance nature is what gives them their raison d'être, if you will. And they felt that they needed to do something. But on the other hand, they have also obligations towards the Iraqi government. They don't want to burn the bridges with the Iraqi government. Again, they felt that they are not in a position Iraq doesn't share a border with Israel. A lot of the means to do anything for the Palestinians or against Israel were very limited. So all they had was, sometimes they would send a drone here and there. And that's because they didn't have. Also, for a long time after October 7, they were really engaged in Syria. And Syria was a brutal fight with ISIS and with other elements in Syria, and they were sucked into that conflict. So that was their priority, rather than doing something, again, across the sovereign land of or a space of two countries, Jordan and Syria. After the recent episode, the Israeli attack on Iran, I believe that all of the friends of Iran, if you will, in Yemen, in Iraq, and Lebanon, have been not called upon to do anything because this was a direct war. I think the Iranians see it as beneath their prestige, if you will, to use proxies or to use small-time acts from their militias here and there, and to fight. So they decided to fight, to return or retaliate against the Israeli attack in kind. In other words, as strong and heavy the Israeli attack was on Iran, Iran thought that they could really match that or even top it with an action of their own. So any act at this point of the conflict, I think, would be not necessary, and even it would suck the importance, if you will, of the Iranian retaliation. Iran didn't ask them, and also, again, we go back to what means do they have to do it. I believe that also the Iraqi government has been day and night talking to everybody to help Iraq avoid, jumping into this conflict, because it could easily, bring Iraq into direct fire from Israel.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning the recent episode, because now I have the question for Mike. I appreciate that, Abbas. Mike, after the Israelis' attacks on Iranian on Friday, June 13, it seems Iranian made a quick decision to not drag United States into the conflict, do not open a direct conflict with America, isolate the conflict with the Israelis. And the evidence of it is that actually Mr. Shekari, General Shekari, the spokesperson of Iran's chief of staff, hours after attack came to the TV, and he says, quote unquote, this is the Israelis and Americans will pay the price for this. About 30 minutes after that statement, the Iranian broadcast, which was bombed yesterday, every single time that they quoted it from the Shekari, they omit the American part. They just say that the Israelis would pay the price for this. Basically, they send the signal that they want to keep things between themselves and the Israelis. Do you think in an event that the United States changes its policy and gets involved, which is possible? It is June 18th, so we don't know which direction it goes, but there is a likelihood of it. Iraqis would change their stand on the conflict and directly get involved, attack on Americans' interests, the American troops in the Iraq, or get engaged other ways?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And very interesting comments by Abbas and Renad about Soleimani's death. I got to say, I got no fond memories of him or al-Muhandis. To me, the convenience of having one person to speak to, or the fact that things seem to be quiet, were not reassuring things. The problem with Americans is that they're very easy to fool, that when things are quiet and when things are easy, that means things are good and things are stable. But in fact, when you have militias kind of eating the country from the inside out, you don't want them to gain respectability, cohesion, to begin to operate the way that Hezbollah does under one leader, or the Houthis do under one leader. You want a lack of cohesion, and you want them to be competing with each other, and you don't want things to be easy. And they certainly, Soleimani and al-Muhandis certainly didn't make life easy for us back in, let's say, June 2011. They killed 29 Americans that month. So they got what they deserved, and not enough. When it comes to the Muqawamah post October 7th, 2023, we've got a tracker at the Washington Institute that looks at every single confirmable attack by the Iraqi Muqawamah against the US-led coalition forces and against Israel from October 2023 through till the end of 2024. I mean, it is hundreds and hundreds of drones, and indeed cruise missiles and rockets very short-range ballistic missile even. So it's not that they did nothing. I don't think they were at all interested in fighting ISIS in southeastern Syria. And I don't think they cared at all about Jordan or Syria's airspace. They shot plenty of stuff across those, and many of which landed in those places. You know, the Muqawamah did what it could after October the 7th. It didn't want to look completely lacking in capability compared to what Hamas had done, compared to what the Houthis were doing, compared to what the Iranians could do. The Iraqi Muqawamah looked like a joke. It was only during the war that the Iranians allowed the Iraqi Muqawamah to have cruise missiles. And that's really only with Houthi advise and assist on the ground to show them how to do it. If you're Iraqis, you know, a strong military nation with a long history, you don't want to be taught how to use Iranian weapons by a bunch of Yemenis. I think the Iraqi groups tried to do what they could because they were sort of humiliated. And you can see that with somebody like Abu Fadak, the head of the chief of staff of the PMF, one of the senior Kataib Hezbollah leaders, US designated terrorist. He from the beginning seemed really aggrieved that they could not fully join the fight against Israel. And Hadi al-Amri sometimes seemed that way as well. They did what they could. It just wasn't very impressive, partly because of distance. They're just too far away from Israel. On the current conflict, I mean, you know, the Iraqi militias have been deterred from going anywhere near Americans from the period December 2023 through to April 2024. That's when we saw from Boxing Day, December 26th, 2023, we saw the Biden administration launch a very heavy strike on a key leadership figure in Iraq. After that, we saw new targeted killings in January and other strikes in March or early April. And, from that point onwards, the Iraqi Muqawamah didn't do anything to the Americans because they knew the Americans had the gloves off and they were going to start killing Iraqi leaders, and because they knew that the Americans potentially even would take it inside Iran after that, because the Biden people had just had enough at that point. And that deterrence has carried over, because if anything, we're in an era now where you feel like anything can happen. Also, the Iraqis don't want to get hit by sanctions, and there are plenty of sanctions at Treasury sitting on the shelf ready to go against the Iraqi oil and gas sector, Iraqi government leadership figures, and others. And because there's an election coming up in Iraq in November, where people like Prime Minister Soleimani don't want a US black mark against him, possibly too late for that. But others don't. Other hopefuls also want to be acceptable to the Americans, who will probably have a more significant say, at least in ensuring we don't get another Muqawamah-controlled prime minister as we had in 2018 under Al Mahdi, and as we had again after November 2022 under Mohammed Shia al-Sudani. So, the Iraqi factions are keeping their head down. Now, if the US goes and bombs Fordo right now, could be happening as we speak, are the Iraqi militias going to attack US bases in Iraq? Yeah, if the Iranians say we're doing a whole axis unity of fronts retaliatory strike, everyone's in, maybe in a limited strike, but something sort of shocking, one thunderous cannonade to say we do not approve, you will pay a price. Yeah, I'm sure they will attack US bases in Iraq. Are we ready for it? Yeah. Will a lot of those strikes get shot down? Yes. And will the Iraqi factions who undertake those strikes absolutely optimize and maximize the chance of killing Americans? Probably not. But they'll need to be seen to do something, and they'll want to rattle the Americans' cage for sure. But it could well be that one big American thunderclap at Fordo results in one big strike across the region at various points of US presence, and then it's gone. Like after Soleimani with the missile attacks on al-Assad. Over.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. Which brings me to Renad. Renad, you, as the rest of us, you're aware of what is happening in the Middle East, which is the conflict between Iranian and Israelis. Abbas and Mike had their take about the role that the PMFs and other Shia militias might play. What's your take on it? Do you think they will get engaged, or do you think their self-interest would kind of convince them that if they are called upon to play the role of defense forward, they would have make a ceremonial, symbolic response, but not something that put themselves and the Iraqi welfare on the jeopardy?
Yeah, I think out of all the countries that have had an axis of resistance, Iraq's the only one that's somehow managed to remain insulated from it. It's tried to stay out of the line of fire in a way, partly because you have in Baghdad still a US presence, a NATO presence, other Western states, but also because I think there is a certain pragmatism, even from some of the PMF leaders who might, speak in rhetoric of resistance, but they also have, for the last several years, gained significant state power and significant economic power through the state. And the price of oil has been high enough for them to all be benefiting. So their situation right now is better than it's ever been in Iraq. And if we talk about, whether Qassem Soleimani's killing was better or worse, and no matter what, the reality is that these groups, like Badr, like Asab al-Haq, like others, Shibl al-Zaidi and others, are, to some extent, trying to transform and enjoying states, being states people. It's Iraq is such a wealthy state with so much oil that this is a benefit. So anything that can destabilize is bad for business, to put it in a very crude way. And I think because of that, while there has certainly been this idea of resistance against Israel, and there have been the attempts to mobilize populations, it hasn't really stuck. And I think also the points made by, Mike and Abbas on the border, of course, Israel is seen as a peripheral issue. Largely, they have bigger sort of day-to-day issues that they're dealing with. They're all fighting each other as well for competing, let's say, for power in an election year. So, to conclude, yes, there is still the ideas of resistance against Israel, but I think you've seen a kind of pragmatism by many of the armed groups that are now in the government.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So self-interest, pragmatism, deterrence, and all of them plays a role in their decision, which brings us into the finale of this panel and the question that I have for all of you. We discussed the Iran-Israel's conflict, its impact on the role that the Shia militias may or may not play in it. But there is a bigger question over here, that what would happen to them in the post-war? The Iranian-Israeli conflict is going to end at some point. Well, we can discuss, and that would be a hell of a different panel, that would the Islamic Republic survive it or not. Time will tell. But Dr. Abbas Kadhim, I want to start with you. How do you see the state of Iraqis, pro-Iran or Iran-affiliated or Iran-backed Shia militias in the day, in the month, in the year after the Iranian-Israeli conflict? And I know it's a hard question, but I need to ask.
It's a good question. I mean, I think Iraq, for most of its recent history, its modern history, has not been close to Iran in any way. I mean, Iraq survived centuries being, having no close or strong ties to Iraq, probably to Iran, probably. I mean, if you think about it, from the beginning of the full control of the Ottomans, 1638, all the way the Zahab Treaty, all the way to through the British occupation of Iraq and invasion and occupation, through the monarchy, through the Arif brothers' time, through the Ba'ath. if there was no, Iraq had its own affairs and its own issues and its own concerns. And if tomorrow Iran were to change into a different regime or continue this way, we've been having this overwhelmingly lazy sort of argument that everything goes in Iran or has to do with Iran. I'm not referring to the conversation here that we have. I'm just, in the way wherever you read about Iraq and you listen and from different quarters. But certainly that's not true. Iraq is a country of 45 million people, of all kinds of ethno-sectarian divides and all issues, etc. There is a lot that Iraqis deal with and, to sort out their own affairs. A lot of the positions are based on Iraqi differences of opinion, differences of position, social, political, economic, you name it, local, and that's not only among the sort of in the macro division that we began to refer to after 2003, but even the micro part of it. Iraq's division and dynamics started after 2003 with Kurds and Shia and Sunnis. Today, actually, the biggest challenge for all Iraqi communities is the ethno-sectarian competition that, Renad was just talking about earlier. You talk about Shia, and I believe Michael also alluded to it. So, yes, whatever happens to Iran, 90% of what goes on in Iraq, the challenges and the opportunities will remain intact, and we will be looking at them closely and analyzing them. Yes, the Iranian dimension of what goes on in Iraq will probably change. But, one way or the other, Iraqi issues will remain interesting for all of us who watch Iraq.
Thank you, Abbas. I appreciate it. Michael?
The Islamic Republic of Iran is very likely going to survive this current era. It may be weaker at the periphery. It's a large country with many, different ethnic and sectarian components of its own. It may have to soften at the center if it doesn't do a mass crackdown. When you weaken like this, when you're unable to protect your own sovereign territory at all, you may end up having to make compromises to the broader population and not rule the country exactly the way you want to. But, this is a gradual process. And, regardless of what happens in the next hours or weeks, by the end of this year, there's a decent chance Iran will be a nuclear armed power. That's the reality, I think, which is that unless you're going to get everything, you're probably going to end up with Iran being an undeclared or declared nuclear power by the end of this year. Wow. How do Iraqis and the Iraqi Muqawamah view that? Look, in the worst case scenario for the Islamic Republic of Iran, it collapses or it changes, and Iraq is a lifeboat for these people. In the best case scenario for the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iran is still greatly weakened. The regime is humiliated, possibly very isolated in an even more hopeless, open-ended North Korea style future, and it will need Iraq as the economic lungs to breathe through, to do oil smuggling, to get access to the global financial system and transportation system, and as a place to procure sanctioned equipment and items. So Iraq is going to be super important to the Iranians, whichever scenario they end up in.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. Renad?
I agree with Mike. Iraq and Iran share a very long border, very long history, and geopolitical competitors as well. Even before the Islamic Republic under the Shah, Iraq was sort of seen as a competition ground for Iran via the opposition groups. So it's hard to predict. I think as analysts, we tend to be a bit conservative in these transformative moments. whether there will be regime collapse or not. But certainly there will be vacuums in Iraq. Can Iraq's leadership push back on some of Iran's influence is a big question, including those that may have historically had relations with Iran. Is this an opportunity for that? Keep in mind that there is still Iraqi nationalism, of course, even among Shia Iraqis. There is the Iran-Iraq divide. There's the Arab-Persian divide as well. That's prominent. But nonetheless, I think what we all agree is that in the next few years, this post-October 7th climate is incredibly unstable and violent. And so wherever Iran goes, whether it goes nuclear or else, Iraq will, I think, continue to be both the lung, the economic lung, but also a battleground. And this will really challenge the kind of last few years of stability that Baghdad has witnessed.
Thank you, Renad. Thank you, Abbas. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Renad. Thank you all. And to our audience, thank you for staying with us in our 4th episode of Axis of Resistance Initiative. And while I'm grateful for your attention, for following our program, I would like to ask you one more time to tune in for our upcoming series, the 5th episode of the Axis of Resistance Initiative, which would be on Syria. We are planning to stream it toward the end of July. You will receive notice and notification about that from us. And once again, thank you.